Before introducing him, I would like to say a few words about the exhibition for those who haven't seen it. Empty Fields is the first exhibition to explore the archive of the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions and the Protestant mission work in the Ottoman Empire and Turkey. The exhibition is made possible through the partnership of SALT, that has been cataloging and digitizing the archive, and the American Research Institute in Turkey, the archive's caretaker. In 2014, SALT sought the assistance of Mariana Hovhannisyan during the process of cataloging this multilingual archive, and subsequently commissioned her to curate an exhibition that reflects on the contemporary urgency of the available content. Hovhannisyan's residency at SALT was supported by the Hunting Foundation Turkey-Armenia Fellowship Scheme funded by the European Union. Working with the archives, the exhibition begins by considering the period when the empire collapsed and the republic was formed, whereby certain archival absences bear the traces of the catastrophe of 1915, and more importantly, how these absences stand for markers of ontological and epistemological areas of study left blank by the effects of the catastrophe. Therefore, the exhibition is shaped around a lost narrative of more than a century-old natural science collection of the Museum of Anatolia College in Merzifonk. Of Professor Ioannis Manisagian, an Armenian-German scientist, botanist, and plant collector, the curator of the museum until 1915. The public program aims to bring contemporary perspectives on the concepts of collection in exile, the agencies of the archives, and museological stories in post-catastrophic events. The first Skype lecture will be by Marc Nichanian under the title of Which Archive for the Survivor? As Nichanian proposes in his abstract, everyone seems to think that trauma calls for archive. The archive is itself the very trauma it will resolve. This double statement by Rebecca Comay'ın has often been misunderstood as though she wanted to denounce the drive to accumulate objects, traces, evidence, documents, as though she wanted to say that too much memory is bad for memory. But archive is not memory. It is rather the contrary, the catastrophe of memory. The survivor of such a catastrophe is entirely stripped of himself, because he is also stripped of the event that made him a survivor. This is the first and essential dimension of the archive. As a consequence, each time we show a particular archive, the survivor appears and disappears behind the image as what he or she is, the dead witness. When concluding, I would like to introduce Marc Nichanian, who was a professor of Armenian studies at Columbia University until 2007, after which he began to teach regularly as a visiting professor at Sabancı University in the program of cultural studies. He is the author of Entre l'art et le témoignage, The Historiographic Perversion, and Edebiyat ve Felaket, the Turkish translation of a series of public lectures in Istanbul. His most recent publications are Mourning for Philology in English, Patker, Patum, Patmutiun, Image Story, History in Armenian, and Le Sujet de l'Histoire vers une phénoménologie du survivant in French. He was also published an Armenian translation of 3 novels by Maurice Blanchot, Death Sentence, The Madness of the Day, The Last Man. Please join me in welcoming Marc Nichanian. Marc, the floor is yours.
I understand that the museal space of SALT is located in the building of the former Ottoman Bank, Bank Ottoman, which obviously should kind of a chain of mixed feelings in the heart of any Armenian aware of the event that happened exactly 120 years ago in 1896. You know the title of my talk. It is formulated in the form of a question. The question is, which archive for the survivor? Which does not mean, of course, that I have already answered the question. It does not mean either that I will tackle the issue head on. You will see. I will navigate around it, first with a few remarks. My first remark will be the following. For me, this is a very unusual format for a lecture. It's actually the first time I'm doing anything like this. I'm sitting here in Lisbon, Portugal, and through a number of channels, of which the control and the functioning are beyond my capacity of comprehension, and yours as well, probably, you are able to listen to me without delay at the very same time, at the very same moment when I speak, although you are thousands of miles away from here. In this case, what troubles me is not the remoteness between the one who speaks and the one who listens to him or to her. It's not the miracle of distant communication. What troubles me is the possibility of being recorded. The fact that as soon as we communicate by means of a technological device, the event in which we together participate can be registered and rebroadcast, relived ad infinitum, thanks to the possibility of archivization. The possibility exists even if it's not implemented, which means that what we call archive is not only or not essentially a memory of the past. It is first and foremost a memory of the future. My voice arrives to your ears. It arrives now, at the moment when I speak, live, and therefore supposedly alive. But because it arrives to your ears through a device that has an archiving potentiality, I could as well be dead when you hear my voice. You hear the voice of a potential dead man. The archiving potentiality of the device transforms me immediately, structurally, into a survivor. This argument is not new, and not very original either. It has been repeated dozens of times by Derrida in his books and interviews, and once again in 2002, in an exchange of questions and answers in Paris, recently republished as it's in French. The title in French is Traces et Archives, Images et Art. In English, it would be Trace and Archive, Image and Art. It's in a book which in French is called, I have the book here with me, it's called the Pensée à ne pas voir, which means thinking of not seeing. The argument, I said, is not new. And by the way, it was not really an argument. It was just the expression of a trouble, that type of awkwardness that comes about when I'm confronted with this archiving power of the device, which transforms me into a survivor. And maybe it was also a first hint on the way to understanding why the usual connection between the archive and the survivor, or the archive and what we call trauma, has to be turned upside down or perceived backward. This reversal of the usual understanding of the relationship between the survivor and the archive has been expressed in different terms by Rebecca Comay'ın in the preface that she wrote for that extraordinary book entitled Lost in the Archives. In my presentation, I wrote the title in the singular. No, it's in the plural, Lost in the Archives, published in 2002 in Toronto. I will quote as I did in the short presentation of the lecture. You heard this already 5 minutes ago. I quote, she says, everyone seems to think that trauma calls for archive, but this gets exactly backward. The archive is itself the very trauma it would resolve. End of the quotation. I'll come back to this seemingly paradoxical formulation a bit later in the course of this lecture. It's a short lecture, by the way. It will last maybe 45 minutes. Yes, it is paradoxical, just as trauma is paradoxical according to our usual experience of temporality, timeliness, and historicity. The one who has been subjected to a trauma is not a subject anymore. That's the paradox. The one who has been subjected to a trauma is not a subject anymore. She or he cannot be the contemporary of his, her own experience. She cannot be the contemporary of her own experience. This is not too difficult to understand, although it is extremely difficult to swallow. It shows at least the legitimacy of our question, which archive for the survivor? Yes, which archive? A collection of testimonies, maybe, gathered on the shelves of American universities. A collection of photographs, maybe, or documents kept for us in the diplomatic archives, or the memories of perpetrators and witnesses waiting for the work of historians. Yes, which archive for the survivor? If it is the very archiving potentiality that deprives me of the capacity to be a subject. If because of it, I am doomed to be a survivor forever. The question, therefore, is legitimate. And yet, we are missing something. You see, the temporal structure of which I was speaking, the temporal structure of the trauma, what Rebecca Comay calls the belatedness. We are never the contemporary of our experience, if we can ever be the contemporary of our experience, whereas, let's say, survivors. The temporal structure is not enough to explain why the archive is itself the very trauma it would resolve. It's a mysterious formulation. Huh? After all, as I explained at the beginning, my being subjected to that temporal structure because of the archiving potentiality of the device may be awkward, may be troubling. It is not traumatic for all that. We obviously need to better understand what the archiving potentiality means. We could not have done that without an event that would involve the archive as such, involve the will to archivization with all its mysterious and traumatic powers. That was part one. Part two. Indeed, we are invited to reflection on the archive on the occasion of a very singular event. Which event is that? It's the museal exhibition of an archive. The archive has entered the museum. That's quite an event. Is this archive comprised of survivors or witnesses' testimonies, of diplomatic documents, of memories, of action photographs? You know, not at all. Does it bring us fragments of a lost homeland? Certainly not. Is it supposed to bear witness in the aftermath of the catastrophe? Maybe, but in that case, it would really be in a very indirect way, you will admit. And in any case, that would mean that the capacity of witnessing our own experience and bearing witness to it has in some way been restored. You understand? If I am able to bear witness in the aftermath of the catastrophe, if the catastrophe is precisely the impossibility of witnessing, then if I am able to bear witness, it means that this capacity has in some way been restored. We already know that while action photographs, photographic fragments of a lost homeland, as they say, as though we had a homeland. Memories of all sorts and all caliber can constitute perfectly respectable documents, while we also know that while they can even be offered as archives, collected in leather-bound books or exhibited in museum-like spaces, they will never, or more exactly, they will nevertheless just confirm and illustrate Rebecca Comay''s rightful assertion that everyone seems to think that trauma calls for archive. Trauma calls always for more archive, more memory. These collections, this archiving impulse will save something maybe. They will save something that indeed could be memory, more memory, lost memory, but they will never save the catastrophe, which is a catastrophe of memory. And consequently, as an archive of testimonies about a past reality, if that is what the archive is, testimonies about a past reality, they will be unable to give us an idea of what it means for the archive to be the very trauma it would resolve. You understand this? Okay. Did I say catastrophe of memory? Did I say that behind the respectable or optionally dubious necessity of saving some aspects of past reality for the sake of memory, there was the pressing necessity of saving the catastrophe itself, if there is such an itself, which once again would explain my title, Which Archive for the Survivor? Then, what does this mean, to save the catastrophe? Do I save the catastrophe when I collect fragments of a past reality, pictures of deportees and starved children? If I work for more memory, do I respond to the catastrophe of memory? That's the question. By the way, Derrida has used at least once this expression, catastrophe of memory, in a beautiful interview with Elizabeth Weber, which dates from 1990, where he was speaking about his book, in French, Felâketzedeye, in English, Cinders, explaining first that, I quote Derrida is speaking, cinders is the destruction of memory, one in which the very sign of destruction is carried off, to which the interviewer objects that there are witnesses, nevertheless. She says the witnesses of the disappearance, even if it is an absolute disappearance. And these improbable witnesses, according to the interviewer, would be, for instance, the readers of Derrida's Cinders. To this objection, Derrida answers as follows, and I quote, it's Derrida, he is speaking. He says, they are strange witnesses. Those, you understand, the witnesses of this absolute disappearance. Because there are witnesses who do not know what they are witnessing. They keep a secret, but without knowing anything about it. They are witnesses to something that they are not witness to. And this situation is not exceptional. In French, it says, ils sont les témoins de quelque chose dont ils ne sont pas les témoins. Is as much paradoxical in French as in English. And here, suddenly, Derrida turns to a we. He sort of includes himself among these improbable witnesses, and he says, I quote again, it's Derrida is speaking. We are witnesses of a secret. We are witnesses of something that we cannot bear witness to. We attend the catastrophe of memory. You see, it's here that he uses the expression, the catastrophe of memory. Nous assistons à la catastrophe de la mémoire in French. One could precisely give great examples, that's still Derrida speaking, collective, historical, political, of witnesses who cannot bear witness, or who do not know what or whom it is that they are bearing witness to. It is a situation that can take on disproportionate, immense dimensions, adequate to the measureless measure of cataclysms, genocides, or the most unbearable murders, but also of the most trivial everyday mess. End of the quotation. Of course, you see, in the course of this lecture, we will remember that catastrophe of memory, that awkward possibility of being witnesses who cannot bear witness. Meanwhile, I was saying that we were invited to a reflection on the archive in connection with a very singular event, the museal exhibition of an archive, the entrance of the archive into the museum. This is a long story whose lineaments are narrated in the captions on the walls of the exhibition, this one, the one called Empty Fields. That story needs to be narrated again, slowly, just for us to perceive exactly at which point the archive has entered the museum. Okay, the American College in Merseyfont was created in 1864. You see, I begin at the beginning, the long story. It was created supposedly as a theological seminary and was transformed into a boarding school in 1886. The college is well known among Armenians, probably more than the similar institutions in Harput and Tarsus, because one of the most sophisticated and powerful poets in the Armenian language, Misak Mezarens, was a student in that college for a few years between 1896 and 1901, 5 years, before going to Istanbul with his family and dying from consumption in 1908 at the age of 22. And after publishing 2 books that are read, of course, until now. I should incidentally add that my grandfather, on my mother's side, was a native of Merseyfont and had also attended the American College. More about him, his life and death in a few minutes. When Mariana Hovhannisyan invited me to give a talk in parallel with the exhibition that she was preparing, of course, she didn't know about my family and their connection to Merseyfont. She didn't know how they were deported, how they survived, and how they died as survivors. Then, it is on the premises of the American College that a Natural Science Museum was created around 1910, just because one of the college's Armenian teachers, Hovhannes Manisajian, was renowned, even a world-renowned botanist and plant collector who had gathered an amazing collection of plants and natural objects. Let's stop here 1 second. Of course, a natural science collection is already an archive. It's an archive that keeps the memory of the earth, a memory that is independent of any human intervention. It presents itself as a geohistorical archive, to borrow the word coined by Bruno Latour, geostory. Such collections and showrooms had existed in Europe at least for 3 centuries before that time, probably since the 17th century. The amazing thing here was just that this one was established in Merseyfont, of all places. We have to deal with an archive already, but clearly it's not here with this archive at that moment that the announced encounter between the archive and the museum takes place, not yet. This means that all of our narrative, we need to elaborate some distinctions between museums and museums, between archives and archives. Every museum is a depository and a showroom for objects that belong to human or natural history. Not every museum collects works of art. Then the question, is it possible that the singular event that we are trying to narrate and to characterize, the entrance of the archive into the museum, has something to do with the museum as a depository of works of art or as repository of images? The work of art, the image, do they have anything to do with the archive? Huh? You can ask yourself the question. The work of art, the image, do they have anything to do with the archive? If there is convergence, an encounter between the archive and the image, between art and archive, then both concepts, the one of art and the one of archive, will need to be thought anew and entirely redefined. I will show this in the last part of this talk that this is the case indeed. But I have been overly hasty. Let's come back to our narrative. In 1915, I understand from what I read in the historical and biographical captions, I didn't know that beforehand, that Nichanian was not deported because his mother was German, and the American missionaries succeeded, at least in his case, to bribe the gendarmes. Gendarmes. For every survivor, there is a reason why he or she survived, and sometimes there is no reason. Nichanian, you know, spent 2 years in Amasya and came back to Merziphone in 1917. Everyone around him had been deported. The staff and the students of the American college had vanished into thin air. Not only the Armenians, also the Americans. Those who were deported never came back. As to the Americans, don't forget that the United States entered the war in 1917. Their representatives could not stay in Turkey. Nichanian then, all by himself, without any help and encouragement, decided to document every single object of the natural science collection. He composed what you have before your eyes, the catalogue of the Museum of Anatolian College. Clearly, he was completing the work of a lifetime. What you can see on the walls of the exhibition are the handwritten pages of that catalogue. In some aspects, Nichanian's gesture is analogous to the enterprise of Hagop Oshagan. You know about Hagop Oshagan, at least in Turkish, because of my book, Edebiyat ve Felaket, where there is pages and pages about him. Then analogous to the enterprise of Hagop Oshagan, who in 1936 set out to write the story of Western Armenian literature in 10 volumes and 5,000 pages, and brought the project to completion in 8 years, at the latest in 1944. 10 volumes, 5,000 pages for literature that had stopped in 1915 and had enjoyed just 60 years of existence, not more. Hagop Oshagan as well was completing the work of a lifetime and was, as a philologist or a literary critic or historian of literature, he was cataloging the literary works gathered on the shelves of the Imaginary Museum of Armenian Literature. In the case of Nichanian, not unlike Oshagan's, the museum was not a museum anymore. The objects were still in the showcases, but the institution had disappeared. He was the curator of a vanished and from now on unreal museum. Henceforth, his catalogue also was not a catalogue anymore. It was the first archive of the survivor. This is why Mariana Hovhannisyan has this beautiful sentence in the caption number 5, the one entitled Inscribing the Empty Fields, the Writing of the Disaster. And the sentence is the following, the short sentence. Thus, she says, the last curatorial act of Professor Nichanian would be his first archival act. End of the quotation. The last curatorial act of Professor Nichanian would be his first archival act. But is what I just said really true? Of course, that moment is impressive. You see that moment when the survivor comes back, sits down before his desk, and begins to obsessively reference all the objects of a collection that has ceased to function as a collection in a museum, because nobody was there anymore to visit the museum and to read the catalogue. The same as for Hagop Oshagan's 5,000-page panorama of Western Armenian literature. The question is, did the catalogue for all that become the first archive of the survivor? Does it from now on bear witness for an absence instead of bearing witness for a presence? I mean, independently of its content. Today, you see, true enough, we are showing the content on the walls. By showing the content, it is clear that we are showing this insane moment. We are showing the insanity of the survivor, of every survivor, but of this one in particular, Marc Nichanian, or for that matter, Hagopo Shagan, the one who comes back and establishes the catalogue of the vanished collection of a vanished museum. Is that enough as an explanation? Through the single act of insanity, did the catalogue really become the archive of the survivor? Where is then that event that from the beginning I call the singular event, the event of the archive's entrance into the museum? You see, because when at the moment when the survivor comes back and establishes the catalogue, it's the first archival act, but the archive has not yet, as an archive, entered the museum. Then the question is, again and again, where does this event take place? Where is then that event that from the beginning I call the singular event, the event of the archive's entrance into the museum? Where does it take place? Again, something is missing. We need one more layer in the narrative in order to understand how the catalogue of a natural science collection could become the first archive of the survivor, all by itself, independently of its content. The archive had yet to become an image. It had to become an image in order to enter the museum. Or it's the entrance into the museum that makes it an image. Anyway. And the archive had yet to become an image, therefore it needed a new type of curator. And to push the analogy with Hagopo Shagan one step further, let's remember that the panorama of Western Armenian literature, this history of story of Western Armenian literature in 5,000 pages, Hagopo Shagan's last act as a curator, which was also his first act as an archivist, that panorama is called in Armenian Hamabatker, which of course usually means panorama, but literally is the general image. Hagopo Shagan had in mind implicitly the transformation of the literary philological archive into an image. When I was myself writing on the panorama in my book, Le Roman de la Catastrophe, it's in French, not translated into English, the novel of the catastrophe. I was myself the curator become image. That was the part 2. Part 3. Before going over to the next layer of the narrative and carrying on our line of reasoning with the hope that we will be able to create a context for what I call the singular event, let me open a parenthesis. One more parenthesis. My Merzifonsi grandfather's name was Hovhannes also. Hovhannes Yepremian. He had immigrated to the United States around 1900. I don't know the exact date. There was no massive immigration of Armenians from the region of the Pontus. In any case, not on the same scale as in the region of Kharkov. The fact probably is that the students of the American colleges knew, the students, yes, of the American colleges knew enough English in order to be able to immediately find their way on the North American continent. Hovhannes then spent 10 years in the United States, came back to Merzifon in 1910, married my grandmother in 1912. My grandmother was from Amasya. They settled in Merzifon. They had a daughter, my mother. They were deported in 1915, like everyone else. They survived one way or another. I'll tell you another day how and why. The fact remained that they came back in Merzifon in 1918 and tried to resume their former life. In 1921, Topal Osman's Chetes were cleansing the region of the Pontus between Samson and Amasya from its Greek population, and in passing, didn't forget the remaining Armenians. My grandfather was killed in July 1921. Women and children were gathered in the Armenian church. They had coated themselves with oil in order to burn more easily. They had given pills of cyanide to the children in order for them to die without too much suffering. This is in Merzifon, in Armenian Merzifon. The church did not burn that day. My mother should have died. She survived. She came back from death. She was 8 years old. She came back, but she never grew up beyond that day, the day she had come back from the realm of the dead. Her life had stopped and did not start again. She was a survivor. Yes, which archive for the survivor? But why would they need an archive? They lived on, if that can be called alive. They were themselves in their souls reduced into ashes, their own archive. And now, after this parenthesis, let us carry on our narrative and our line of reasoning about the archive. We understood that the decisive moment was the one when Nichanian obsessively composed a catalogue for a collection that would never be displayed again. We understood that what was decisive in that decisive moment was not the content, but the act that changed its nature of act, or the changing nature of the act, from curatorial to archival. It is this very change of nature of the act that is displayed on the walls of your showroom, thanks to the curatorial work of Mariana Hovhannisyan and to the hospitality of Saad. It is this very change of nature of the act that is offered to the gaze of the audience. We have here the archive in the instant of its emergence. What we see on the walls, therefore, is not the natural science catalogue. It is the catalogue already transformed into an archive. It was transformed into an archive at the very moment when it was written down, composed, assembled. Therefore, the archival nature, what is shown on the walls, does not come from the fact that the catalogue was found a century later, 2 years ago, in the archives of the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. The archival nature was there right from the start. The catalogue became archive, inscribed the catastrophe within itself at the very moment of its conception and inception. This was the indispensable condition for understanding what I call the singular event of this exhibition. The archive, as such, entered the museum, which means it elaborated for itself a space of visibility. It offered itself to the contemporary gaze, and by doing that, it let the catastrophe glow and glisten behind the image. At this point, a natural objection forces its way to our mind. An objection, yes. If it's a question of documenting the destruction, of bringing it to the eyes of our contemporary, is it not true that archives of testimonies, or still better, photographic archives, if they exist, could be excellent candidates for the entrance into the museum, for the creation of an adequate space of visibility? Here I skip a few lines about Zabel Essayan. You know, Zabel Essayan was the first one she was in Baku, who published the first long testimony of a survivor that she transcribed, she rewrote in her beautiful Armenian. This has been my translation of that testimony, has been published in French 2-3 years ago. Again, it's only in French, not in English. And for 2 years, between 1960 and 1980, she was busy with transcribing and rewriting testimonies. She brought with her a whole file made up of interviews, documents, photographs to Paris in 1918. The archive has disappeared. But now a second remark on this objection. What was the objection? The objection was that if we want to show, to bring before the eyes of the contemporaries, an archive of destruction? Was it not, I would say, the archives of testimonies or photographic archives not better candidates for the entrance into the museum? Recently, someone called Emmanuel Aloha gave a lecture at Columbia University with the title Remediate the Blackout, the Photographic Archive of the Armenian Catastrophe. Because there are some photographs, you will see. In the abstract of his talk, he refers to the category of post-memory. He explained as I quote, a traumatic past. Post-memory is a traumatic past which is not directly remembered in first person, but is handed down to later generations and is recalled through the mediation of narratives and images, which become prostheses for a lack of direct memory. And he asks in the presentation of his talk the following questions. I quote, how is it, he says, that these prosthetic recollections do not simply substitute for what lacks, but seem to shape the very events they are meant to reproduce, and so on. And the last sentence of this presentation of him, how to think, he says, an after image of something that was never seen in the first place. You see, these are obviously important questions which point in the same direction as our which archive for the survivor, with an emphasis on the image and the connection between trauma and image. And of course, Emmanuel Aloha refers to the only collection of photographs that was passed down to us from the time of the Armenian deportation, the photographs that Armin Wegner took in 1915 and 16, despite the strict prohibition against any use of the photographic apparatus. These photographs, as you know, for a large part represent and document the plight of the Armenian deportees in the Syrian desert. Of course, they represent and document only those who are still living on, not the dead. Is it not true then that Armin Wegner's photographs have been shown here and there and consequently have already entered the museum, have already created for themselves some visibility and have in any case defied the ban against representation? And the answer is, yes, this is true. And by the way, the ban is still in force. You know that I doubt that this photographic archive has ever been shown in Turkey, and the ban is still in force. And yes, this is true, but you immediately see the difference. Armin Wegner's photographs document the deportation. They bring some rare images of these people on the brink of starvation, but they do not document the becoming archive of the image and the becoming image of the archive. They do not transform the self-understanding of the museal space. They do not register the transformation that takes place when the museal space hosts the archive as such. The question then remains untouched after the objection. The question was and is still what happens when it is the archive as such that enters the museal space, when the image shows itself as an archive, when it exhibits its becoming archive instead of exhibiting the content of the image. Zabel Essayan's and Armin Wegner's counterexamples are illustrating only one side of Rebecca Comay''s seemingly paradoxical formulation, time and again the same side, which was trauma calls for archive. Of course, trauma calls for archive. They leave us entirely helpless as to the other part. The archive is itself the very trauma it would resolve. They do as though the experience of the trauma were possible, as though we could be the witnesses of our own traumatic experiences or experience, and then at a later stage, bear witness for it. These examples, these photographs, these testimonies need all our attention, I'm sure, but they totally ignore what it means to be a survivor. They ignore that the survivor is the one in which the capacity of witnessing, the capacity of being one's own witness, and let's say redundantly, the capacity of being the witness of one's own experience has been killed once and for all. That was part 3. Part 4. Here is the challenge. we were confronted with. The necessity and the desire to isolate this singular event, the entrance of the archive into the museum, the encounter between the image and the archive, even the fusion image archive, the overlapping of what we call art and what we call archive, which obliges us to redefine both of the terms, art and archive, and to reconceptualize the work of the post-traumatic curator, who has to deal with art and archive at the same time, the one because of the other. Yes, but the fact is that this predicament, as mysterious as it may be, or it may seem, is not new at all. After all, it was precisely this overlapping between art and archive, the fusion between the image and the archive, that brought Rebecca Comay'ın to gather dozens of contributions around the title Lost in the Archives, and to put together, I have the book with me, I will show the book to you. It's a thick book of 800 pages. It's here, Lost in the Archives. Together, I said, dozens of contributions around the title Lost in the Archives, and to put together the spectrographies of Jacques Derrida, the archival power of the image in Chris Marker's video films, the story of recording technologies, dear to Friedrich Kittler, the archives of Holocaust testimonies through an interview with Jeffrey Hartman about the issues surrounding the videotaping of survivors in the Yale archive of Holocaust testimony, or the recording of recordings through, again, an interview with Atome Goyan. I will take this last example as our guide, very short, for a very short while. The interview with Atome Goyan is called, it's in the book, Lost in the Archives. It's called Crap and Other Matters. It took place in 2001, a few months after the release of Egoyan's latest production, the film version of Beckett's play, Crap's Last Tape, which was part, the film version, of an international film series commissioned by the Irish television to film Beckett's entire corpus. In the play, a tape recorder produces an archival memory, which can be reactualized by the character on a regular basis, or after 20 years, or never again, it's all the same. But recording the play for television, in turn, you see, creates an archive that will gather all the plays written by Beckett, just in order for them to be stored in some museum of video images. The one time of the theater play and the uniqueness of the work of art have been replaced by the reproducible image and entered the museum. Walter Benjamin's reflection on the work of art in the time of its reproducibility was first and foremost a reflection on the archive, of course, on the encounter between art and archive, on the entrance of the archive into the museum, real or virtual. This is how it should be read, that beautiful essay of Walter Benjamin. And this, in any case, is how the archive has already entered the museum, you see, long before empty fields and the pieces of an archive exhibited on the walls. Long before, indeed, because before Egoyan and before Beckett and his tape recorder, the invention of the photographic apparatus and the possibility of archiving the instant within an image had already made possible a fusion between the image and the archive, and that confusion between art and the archive. Walter Benjamin, who, unless I missed his name, is strangely absent in the book edited by Rebecca Comay'ın, has been the first one who tried to take full stock of this phenomenon. In his small history of photography, in the essay on the work of art, and in his thesis on history. And of course, he has also been the first one who felt the necessity of deploying a photographic conceptuality in order to give an adequate account of history as catastrophe, which simply means history experienced and written from the point of view of the survivor, which you can be sure it's not the same as history written by historians. Then, my last lines and last paragraph. Maybe the singular event, the one that we sought to isolate and to put forth in our own effort to understand what was happening when the archive entered the museum. That singular event maybe was not that singular after all. It is not that singular if we consider it in the continuity of the revolution operated in the 19th century by the photographic apparatus and the fusion of archive and image that revolution made possible and of which we are experiencing the after effects. It becomes singular only if we are able to see in the archival images, in all archival images, in the archive become image, the presence and the absence of the survivor, the haunting image of the survivor. It becomes singular if each time through the image, behind and beyond the photographic image, we are able to re-experience the moment when the curator becomes an archivist. That was my talk. I am very thankful for your patience.